Saigon, MACV Headquarters, March 1971. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. The ceiling fans in Saigon never really cooled the air. They just pushed it around, thick, damp, smelling faintly of paper, sweat, and the exhaust of a war that was trying to pretend it was winding down. In a windowless office inside MACV headquarters, a U.S. Army investigator worked late, doing what wars always leave behind: the paperwork, routine audits, after-action reports, patrol summaries, names, grids, times, body counts. A bureaucratic river of ink meant to make chaos look orderly. Then he opened a folder that wasn't supposed to be interesting. Incident Reports, Allied Coordination, January to March 1971. 3 pages of nothing, and behind them, 1 sheet, typed on an Australian Defence Force typewriter. No classification stamp, no reference number, no signature block, just 11 paragraphs describing a confrontation so raw, so openly humiliating, that the last line called it a complete breakdown in Allied command authority during active operations. The investigator read it once, then again, slowly, because it didn't just describe insubordination. It described a moment when experience, mud under the nails, jungle-earned experience, stood up in a planning room and told an American commander, in effect, "You don't know what you're doing here," and for a few seconds, authority didn't win. The investigator photocopied the page, sent it up the chain, and waited for someone senior to explain it away. The answer came back within 48 hours. The document did not exist. No such incident occurred. Destroy the copy. Make no further inquiries. Officially, it was erased. But the investigator, like a lot of men in Vietnam, didn't fully trust the official story. He destroyed the photocopy. And made another. That second copy went to Sydney, sat in a drawer for decades, and eventually found its way into archives, quietly filed where it would only surface if someone knew exactly what to search for. The kind of hidden artifact that war produces when truth becomes inconvenient. Now, here's the part that makes this story matter. It wasn't just an argument. It wasn't just an Australian sergeant being difficult. It was the collision of 2 philosophies of war, 2 cultures of command, on a continent where mistakes didn't cost reputations. They cost lives. The confrontation described on that page allegedly happened on the morning of February 23, 1971, in dense secondary jungle near an enemy sanctuary. Americans called the Iron Triangle, a place where trails were invisible until they weren't, where a wrong step could open a kill zone, where the vegetation didn't just conceal the enemy, it protected him. One man in the story is an Australian infantry sergeant, an NCO who had walked more patrols through that kind of country than most officers had walked corridors. The other is a U.S. Army major, West Point polished, doctrine-trained, operating inside a system that depended on hierarchy the way a helicopter depends on lift. And between them, ARVN soldiers. The men Vietnamization was supposed to empower, caught in the blast radius of Allied pride. Because by early 1971, the Americans were drawing down. Units were redeploying. The war was being handed off, which meant the remaining operations were often a strange patchwork of advisory teams and Allied attachments, trying to hold seams together while the whole fabric of the war strained under its own weight. And in that environment, a single planning decision, where to land, when to move, which direction to sweep, could mean the difference between a clean operation and a body bag zipped closed in the mud. That's why this incident, buried, denied, and whispered through time, still carries a charge. It forces an uncomfortable question. What happens when the man with the rank doesn't have the ground truth, and the man with the ground truth refuses to let the rank get people killed? If you enjoy untold military stories like this, the ones that live in the gaps between official reports, consider subscribing to Australia's Secret Wars. Because the real war is often hidden behind the neat lines on a map. And this map, according to that page, was about to become lethal, because the sergeant didn't just disagree, he refused to go, and by lunchtime, soldiers were bleeding in water-filled patties exactly where he said they would. But the story doesn't end with the humiliation. It gets stranger. Because weeks later, the American major came back, through official channels, with a request that sounded impossible in a war built on rank. He asked the Australian sergeant for help, and that's where the words, "get out of my way," stop being an insult, and start becoming a turning point. The team, the doctrine, and the war. Inside the war. Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AATTV. To understand how an Australian sergeant could openly defy an American major and survive it, you have to understand the kind of men Australia sent to Vietnam and the kind of war they thought they were fighting. The Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the AATTV, known simply as the Team, wasn't built like a conventional battalion. It was a specialist advisory unit, raised in 1962, made up largely of mature, experienced soldiers, often drawn from infantry and special operations backgrounds, men who already carried jungle wars in their bones from places like Malaya and Borneo. They didn't arrive as kids chasing medals. Many arrived as seasoned professionals with the quiet confidence of men who had already learned what the bush does to the careless. They trained and advised South Vietnamese forces. They worked in small groups, often isolated, sometimes living with the very troops they were advising. It was intimate soldiering, personal, close enough to smell fear and fatigue on the men beside you. And because they were dispersed across the country, sometimes far from the safer big unit infrastructure, their survival depended on reading the environment properly: tracks, birds, silence, the wrong smell on the wind. That Australian instinct, patience, stealth, minimum exposure, clashed hard with much of the American operational machine. By 1971, the U.S. Army had been running Vietnam through a system that often rewarded tempo and measurable outputs. Sweep, search, engage, count, report. It was an industrial approach to a guerrilla war, and it bred an institutional hunger for plans that looked decisive on paper: phase lines, time hacks, insertions at dawn, and the comforting belief that if you moved enough men through enough grid squares, the enemy would eventually run out of places to hide. But the jungle doesn't care about calendars, and the enemy had been living inside that jungle longer than any Allied staff officer had been alive. The account tied to the "get out of my way" incident frames the Australians as operating differently: smaller patrols, longer time in the bush, more emphasis on silence and contact drills, less reliance on announcing their presence with artillery preparation or noisy helicopter insertions. Whether every detail of that characterization is perfectly fair or not, the underlying truth is well established. Australian forces in Vietnam developed a reputation for junglecraft and patient operations, while U.S. doctrine often reflected a larger, firepower-centric institution. Now, drop those differences into the political reality of 1971. Vietnamization wasn't theory anymore. It was policy in motion. U.S. troop strength was falling rapidly as American combat units were pulled out, leaving ARVN to carry increasing responsibility, often with advisory teams stitched in to hold coordination together. The war, at ground level, became a patchwork of mixed nationality personnel, mismatched expectations, and the kind of tension that never shows up in official communiques. That's where the two key figures enter the story as the recovered page describes them. On one side, Sergeant Keith Paxton, reportedly a 34-year-old Australian from 7RAR, with months of continuous patrolling behind him and an instinct for terrain that could not be taught in classrooms. A man described as laconic, practical, and allergic to theatrics, someone who didn't need to raise his voice because the jungle itself validated him. On the other, Major Vincent Carosa, reportedly 38, West Point class of 56, on his second Vietnam tour, temporarily commanding a composite advisory element attached to ARVN, conducting sweep operations. Not portrayed as evil, just conventional. A man shaped by an institution where command authority was the spine of everything. And between them, ARVN units, expected to execute plans built from aerial photos and weeks-old intelligence while navigating terrain that could turn a straight line on a map into a slow-motion disaster. Here's the pressure cooker. In Allied operations, especially during drawdown, everyone is watching everyone else. The Americans are sensitive to criticism because the war is tearing their politics apart. The ARVN officers are sensitive because it's their country and their men. The Australians are sensitive because their methods are often misunderstood, either admired or resented, rarely treated neutrally. So, when a sergeant questions a major's plan in front of indigenous forces and Allied personnel, it's not just a tactical dispute. It's a social explosion. It implies the major can't see what the sergeant sees. It implies the chain of command is blind. And, in a war already fraying, blind command is the fastest route to tragedy. The recovered account describes a planning meeting on February 22, 1971. A map, grease pencil phase lines, landing zones, timings. A plan that, to a staff-trained eye, looked standard. Then Paxton speaks, 3 words that slice through the room like a bayonet. Won't work, sir, source, and suddenly the audience knows something the characters don't want to admit. This operation is already in trouble, because if the sergeant is right, the map is a lie, and if the major doubles down, somebody else pays the price. Next, we go into that room, minute by minute, where pride, protocol, and jungle truth collide, and a career-ending sentence is spoken without hesitation. You're going to get those ARVN boys killed. Recovered account is narrated. The planning meeting, as the account describes it, takes place at 1900 hours. Night settles outside. Inside, light pools on a paper map, 1 to 50,000 scale, marked in grease pencil like a promise. Major Carosa lays out the operation. 3 landing zones, 3 ARVN companies, a coordinated sweep, extraction by late afternoon. Clean, controlled, timed. It's not just a plan, it's the major's authority made visible. Then, Sergeant Paxton breaks the surface of the room with a flat statement. The plan won't work. No theatrics, no bravado, just a professional warning delivered like a diagnosis. Source. The major's reaction isn't immediate rage, it's something colder, the sound of a system tightening its grip. Would you like to elaborate, Sergeant? Paxton steps to the map without asking permission. That tiny movement matters. In military culture, maps are command property. Officers own the plan. Enlisted men execute it. Paxton touches the grease pencil lines like they're tripwires. He points to the easternmost landing zone. Too close to a known VC supply trail, the Hueys will be heard for kilometers. The enemy will have time to fade, or worse, set a hasty ambush. The major replies with the comfort of intelligence staff language. Caches are stationary. No concern about maneuver forces. Paxton hits back with the thing no staff officer likes to hear. The intelligence is old. The jungle changes. The enemy adapts. The map is not the ground. Source. He points to another landing zone. Elephant grass, 8 feet high, no fields of fire. Contact in that grass turns into chaos. Friendly fire risks, lost cohesion, panicked shooting at shadows. Carosa counters. Aerial photography, terrain assessment, dry season imagery. Paxton reminds him it's late wet season. Flooding, slow movement, noise. You'll slog, exhausted, and you'll be loud enough to announce your approach like a parade band. Source. In the room, ARVN, officers watch this exchange with the fascination of men witnessing something forbidden. The 2 South Korean NCOs remain stone-faced. The major's ears redden. Not because he's being tactically outmaneuvered, but because he's being outmaneuvered by a sergeant. And then Paxton points to the phase line that crosses open paddy. 300 meters with no cover, no concealment, morning sun at the attackers' backs. A classic exposure problem. Backlit silhouettes, waterlogged footing. A place where machine gun fire doesn't just hit you, it pins you in the open like an insect on a board. "This is how you take casualties, sir," he says as the account describes it. Source: that sentence isn't just criticism. It's prophecy. And prophecy is dangerous in a planning room because it forces a commander into a choice. Adjust the plan and admit the sergeant may be right, or continue and prove the sergeant wrong. Pride loves the second option. The major stands. He reasserts the chain of command, the coordinated Allied operation, the established hierarchy. He tells Paxton his role is to observe and report, not to question planning. Source Paxton answers, "Yes, sir." But he doesn't move away from the map. He doesn't yield the ground. The operation proceeds as briefed. All elements dismissed. The room empties. ARVN officers file out. Koreans follow. The major gathers his notes, thinking, perhaps, that the friction has been contained. Then Paxton speaks again. "I'm not going, sir." Source: the air changes. Carosa freezes. "What did you say?" Paxton repeats it. Calm. Unshaken. He says he's attached as an observer, that he doesn't take orders from U.S. command, and that he will not participate in an operation he believes will cause unnecessary ARVN casualties. Source: now, it's not a debate, it's a rupture. The account describes the major threatening a formal complaint. Paxton, unmoved, says the major is welcome to file it, and that Paxton will file his own report noting that tactical deficiencies were identified and dismissed. And then, according to the narration of that recovered page, Paxton delivers the line that turns this into legend. "You're going to get those ARVN boys killed because you're too bloody proud to admit you don't know how to run an operation in this country." Source: that sentence is a demolition charge. It attacks competence, not rank. It attacks pride, not procedure. And worst of all, if Paxton is right, it means the major's authority is not just flawed. It's lethal. Carosa orders him out. Paxton leaves the compound. And somewhere in the night, the major sits with a plan he no longer fully trusts, and a hierarchy he can't afford to undermine. Because to change the operation now would be to admit, in front of Allied and indigenous eyes, that a sergeant just saved him from himself. So dawn comes. Hueys spin up, and Paxton is not on them. By 0930, 2 ARVN are dead and 7 are wounded. Exactly where the sergeant said they would be exposed. Source: but here's the hook that keeps the story alive. If that was the humiliation, what happened next was the reversal, because the major doesn't escalate. He learns, slowly, painfully, and he comes back with something almost unheard of in wartime command culture. He asks the sergeant to lead. The cost of being right in war, account and timeline. The operation goes forward as planned. The helicopters announce themselves to the jungle long before boots touch ground. ARVN companies land into terrain that immediately steals cohesion. Elephant grass swallowing formations, flooded areas slowing movement to a crawl. And then comes the open paddy, a place that looks harmless on a map, just a blank space between tree lines. But in Vietnam, blank spaces are where men die because there's nowhere to hide. At 0927 hours, the first burst of AK fire rips out from the tree line. 3 ARVN drop in seconds. 1 killed instantly, 2 wounded. The rest try to respond, but they can't identify targets. They're standing in shallow water, exposed, sun in their eyes, rounds snapping past like angry insects. Source: the company commander calls for gunship support. 12 minutes. Good, by operational standards. An eternity when you're pinned in open ground. Before the gunships arrive, another ARVN soldier is killed and 5 more are wounded. Then the enemy breaks contact, vanishing back into the vegetation as if the jungle itself swallowed them. No bodies recovered, no caches found. The sweep continues for hours because the major insists on completing it as planned. Extraction on schedule. A report that reads like routine. And somewhere in the silence after the rotor wash fades, the cost remains. 2 dead, 7 wounded, and nothing gained except a lesson that can't be written down without embarrassing someone. The account describes a handwritten note left on the major's desk later. 3 short sentences. 2 dead, 7 wounded, you were told. No signature. Just the kind of blunt judgment soldiers leave when they know the official system won't speak truth. Source. Then the story pivots in a way that feels almost unreal for Vietnam. Sergeant Paxton is quietly reassigned away from advisory duties. Officially, operational requirements. Unofficially, he complicates things. He's too direct, too correct, too dangerous to keep near men who prefer the comfort of procedure over the discomfort of adaptation. Source. In most armies, that's where it ends. The system protects itself. The sergeant gets sidelined. The major continues, bruised but intact. But the account says 3 weeks later, on March 16, 1971, Major Carosa does something extraordinary. He requests Paxton's advice, formally, through channels, on a new operation deeper into enemy sanctuary. It's bureaucratic language translating a simple message: we need help. And when Paxton walks back into the planning meeting, the atmosphere has changed. The arrogance is gone, replaced by something harder, a commander who has seen the bill for his certainty and doesn't want to pay it again. Source Paxton doesn't wait politely. He starts marking the map. Wrong insertion point, wrong sweep direction, wrong time. He wants the operation to begin before dawn. He wants quiet insertion, canopy cover, wind and sun used as allies instead of enemies. When the major asks how Paxton knows where sentries would be, Paxton answers with the simplest and most frightening truth in the fieldcraft. Because that's where I'd put them. Source. Then comes the moment that completes the humiliation. Not with shouting, but with terms. Carosa asks Paxton to be there. Paxton refuses to consult. He patrols. Carosa, swallowing pride, asks him to patrol with them. Paxton delivers the line that would normally end careers. He implies the major wants him along to make sure you don't chug it up again. And instead of exploding, Carosa says, yes. Source Paxton demands command of the point element. The major, who technically outranks everyone in that room, agrees. That is not a small concession. That is a commander admitting that in this environment, competence must override the normal shape of authority. The operation launches at 0400 hours, darkness intact. Helicopters low, lights off, insertion quiet. 96 ARVN. Soldiers and advisors on the ground in minutes. Paxton leads the point element through darkness by compass bearing and feel. They establish positions before sunrise, and they wait. Source. At first light, VC emerge. Routine, relaxed, unguarded. Paxton counts. He lets them gather. Then initiates the ambush. The engagement is over in under a minute. 17 enemy dead. Intelligence captured. 0 ARVN casualties. Source. The aftermath is quiet, almost cynical. The after-action report doesn't celebrate the Australian method openly. It buries the credit in a sentence about attached Australian personnel being valuable, because acknowledging the truth too loudly would mean admitting that the earlier doctrine, maps, timelines, noisy insertions, had been feeding men into predictable danger, and that is the deeper discovery at the heart of this story. The most lethal thing in war isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the inability of an institution to admit it needs to change. In the final section, we bring it home. What this incident reveals about leadership under fire, about ego, and about why the best commanders are the ones brave enough to be corrected. Expertise versus authority. The war inside the chain of command. Reflection drawn from account. War is often portrayed as courage versus fear. But in the real machinery of combat, another fight runs underneath the gunfire. Quiet, constant, and sometimes more dangerous than the enemy. It's the fight between authority and expertise. Authority is necessary. Without it, units fracture. Orders become suggestions. Fire support goes uncoordinated. Men die because nobody owns the decision. But expertise is what keeps authority honest. Expertise is the lived knowledge that comes from paying attention in places where paying attention is the only armor you've got. The "get out of my way" incident, as described in the recovered narrative, shows what happens when authority forgets that expertise exists beneath it. A U.S. Army major arrives with a plan that looks correct in the fluorescent safety of a briefing room. 3 LZs, phase lines, timings, a concept of operations. Something that can be controlled and reported. Source: an Australian sergeant, built by patrols rather than paperwork, sees the plan like a hunter sees a trap, not as shapes on a map, but as sound, smell, sun angle, water depth, likely enemy positions, and the simple mathematics of exposure. He speaks up. He is dismissed. He refuses to participate. And then the plan produces the outcome he predicted. ARVN, casualties in an open paddy, enemy contact with no decisive result, and a report that turns blood into brief engagement. Source: that is the first lesson. Maps can be lies. Not because they're inaccurate, but because they're incomplete. A map shows where the paddy is. It doesn't show how the sun blinds men moving through it. It shows tree lines, not what it feels like to be pinned in shallow water while gunfire finds you faster than your radio can. The second lesson is more uncomfortable. Pride kills faster than bullets. Not the pride of nations, although that matters too, but the personal pride of men in command positions who believe that changing a plan is the same as losing face. In Vietnam, face could be fatal. The major in this story, again, as the recovered account frames him, doesn't change the plan after the sergeant challenges it, because to change it would be to admit the chain of command is not the same thing as competence. So he commits, and men pay. Source: but the story doesn't paint him as a villain, and that matters because the best war stories aren't propaganda. They're warning signals. The major learns. He learns in the way war forces learning, through consequences. And then he does the thing that separates a rigid commander from a leader. He comes back and asks for help. That's the third lesson. Adaptation is leadership. The Australian sergeant's bluntness is not just attitude, it's a battlefield ethic. It's the belief that saving lives outranks preserving feelings. In many military cultures, especially inside infantry and special operations communities, the harshest words are sometimes the most compassionate, because they prevent the more permanent language of casualty notifications. Source: when the major finally gives Paxton control of the point element, it's a quiet confession. I outrank you, but you understand this ground better than I do. In that moment, the chain of command doesn't break. It evolves, and the result, quiet insertion, patient waiting, controlled ambush, captured intelligence, no friendly casualties, shows what happens when an institution's habits are temporarily overridden by fieldcraft and humility. Source: now widen the lens. This isn't just a Vietnam story. It's a universal military problem. Every army wrestles with it. The temptation to believe that doctrine is reality, that plans are truth, that rank equals knowledge. But war punishes that belief, because the enemy gets a vote. The terrain gets a vote. Weather gets a vote. Fatigue gets a vote. And the first soldier to step into an unseen kill zone doesn't care what the operational order looked like. He cares whether someone listened to the person who knew better. If this story is accurate in its details, and its existence in the archives is described as deliberately obscured, then its suppression makes grim sense. It's not flattering. It suggests that Allied coordination can fail not because of enemy action, but because of human ego wearing a uniform. And that's why this kind of story belongs on Australia's Secret Wars. Because sometimes the most decisive battle isn't fought with artillery or airstrikes. Sometimes it's fought in a planning room, with a grease pencil map, and an NCO willing to risk everything to say the words nobody wants to hear. In the end, the phrase, "get out of my way," isn't really about disrespect. It's about urgency. It's the sound of a soldier stepping between a bad plan and the people who would die carrying it out. And if there's a single thought to leave you with, it's this. In combat, the highest form of discipline isn't obedience. It's the courage to prevent unnecessary death, especially when the person you're contradicting outranks you. If you want to hear more untold stories from Australia's Secret Wars, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next story.